We might start right now. Hi, my name is Adrian Martinez. Welcome to this webinar, A Climate Justice Approach to the Loss and Damage Fund. Buenos días, muchas gracias por acompañarnos a este webinar sobre un enfoque de justicia climática hacia el Fondo de Daños y Pérdidas. Vamos a, hoy vamos a contamos con traducción simultánea, pueden activarla en la barra de abajo de Zoom. También estaremos recibiendo preguntas. Pueden usar esa aplicación que tiene Zoom también. Y voy a estar hablando en inglés para introducir el webinar, pero ustedes pueden, pues, escuchar el audio en español. Muchísimas gracias. Okay. Good morning, Nusrat. Thank you for joining and to everyone for joining this webinar on climate justice and an approach to the loss and damage fund. This is a topic that is super interesting for us and hopefully also for the audience. And we have simultaneous interpretation you can access in the platform below in Zoom. And also we'll be using the Q&A section. My name is Adrián Martínez. I'm the director of La Ruta del Clima. La Ruta del Clima, it's a leading international and Latin American NGO that focuses on political advocacy to promote public participation and on international climate governance. And it seeks to work with other organizations as an agent of climate knowledge to share and to collaborate together. And we seek to draw attention to the need to address the adverse impacts of climate change in our communities, especially in the response to loss and damage from a responsibility and justice perspective. So today we're joined by a very esteemed colleague, Nusrat Naushin, and we're going to be discussing how does a climate justice approach looks in light of the loss and damage fund. How could the loss and damage fund approach its work from justice and considering human rights and responsibilities? Nusrat is currently working as a program coordinator at the International Center for Climate Change and Development, ICCAD. She has been coordinating ICCAD loss and damage program for the past 2 years and is actively engaged in various research projects on loss and damage. She was previously engaged in the Climate Vulnerable Forum in Bangladesh presidency, and her research interest lies in the domains of loss and damage, particularly on non-economic loss and damage, climate finance, storytelling, and advocacy. So we have a very special guest, and we're super happy to have her on. And thank you, Nusrat, for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much, Adrian, and the entire Luta del Clima Association for inviting me in this very interesting webinar and this podcast. So thank you so much. So today's the topic that I've been invited for is very interesting, and it's very important at this point in time, because we'll be reflecting on one of the most pressing challenges, which is essentially the increasing devastating impacts of climate change. Now, every time we go into the fields to talk to community, they know what disaster is, they know what extreme events are. They can somehow understand what kind of slow impacts like sea level rise are and salinity intrusion can be, because they face those impacts and they face the consequences, but they often do not know the concept of climate change itself. So it's very important to relay that kind of information, that what really entails on, or what are the causes of the impacts that they're facing. And it's very important that, now for decades now, this negative impacts has been coined as the term loss and damage. So it's important now that we try to address these loss and damage, as it is increasing by the minute as we speak. And it's very also important to make sure that while we're addressing these impacts, that we try to make it through a climate justice lens, because these two concepts of loss and damage and climate justice are very rigorously intertwined within each other. So before I start today's talk or today's presentation, I want to show a very quick video so that you can get a kind of an idea on what loss and damage is. Oh, and I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself. I'm Nusrat Noshin. I'm working at the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and we're based in Bangladesh. So as Adrian mentioned, that a lot of our research work is based in the LDCs, particularly in Bangladesh. So the video that I will be showing is from a recent community visit that we had done in the coastal regions of Bangladesh. So you can see what kind of are the impacts that are I'm talking about or blabbering about, what those really are in reality. So I'll quickly share my screen so that you can take a look at that.
পাহাড়, নদী, বিল এবং দিগন্ত জোড়া কৃষি জমি বাংলাদেশে আমার নিজ জেলাকে দিয়েছে অপার সৌন্দর্য, নেত্রকোনা। এখানকার বেশিরভাগ মানুষই কৃষিকাজ করে। আমি বড় হয়েছি বাবাকে ধান চাষ করতে দেখতে দেখতে। আমাদের উঠানে প্রায় সারা বছরই ধান ও খড় ছড়িয়ে ছিটিয়ে থাকতো, কিন্তু সময় বদলে যাচ্ছে। শেষ গ্রীষ্মকালে বন্যায় অনেক পানি হয়েছিল এবং সেটা অনেক দিন ধরে ছিল। একটানা বৃষ্টি হতে দেখেছি আমরা সময় মতো ধান শুকাতে পারিনি। আমাদের ধান পচতে শুরু করেছিল। এতে আমার পরিবারের আয় প্রভাবিত হয়েছে। একটা গবেষণা প্রজেক্ট আমাকে দুর্গাপুর উপজেলায় নিয়ে এসেছে। এই জায়গাটি আমার গ্রাম থেকে 30 মিটার দূরত্বে অবস্থিত। এখানকার মানুষও আবহাওয়ার পরিবর্তনগুলো অনুভব করতে পারে। কিভাবে দেখছেন?
আমি এটাকে দেখছি, এটা প্রকৃতি যেমন নিজেরাই নিজে পরিবর্তন হইতেছে, এটা আমরা রোধ করে ক্ষমতা, কিন্তু আমরা এটাকে আরও বেশি রোধ করছি, বেকাবানি করতেছি। অন্যদিকে একটা গাছ কাটে মানে ক্ষতি চিন্তা করলাম, আবহাওয়াকে ক্ষতি করলাম, এটাও প্রকৃতিকে ক্ষতি করলাম, এটা এফেক্ট করবে আমাকে। ইঞ্জিনের ধোঁয়া, মেন কাঠার ধোঁয়া, এটা পরিবেশে ব্যাপক ক্ষতি করতেছে। এতে ক্ষতির ভুক্তভোগী হইতে হবে জনগণ, দেখুন জনগণ বা নাগরিকরা, দেশবাসী যারা আছে তারা ক্ষতিতে। আর এই খরা হইতেছে, এই অনাবৃষ্টি হইতেছে, বৃষ্টি হইতেছে, অতিবৃষ্টি, অনাবৃষ্টি, এগুলো মানে নিয়ম দেখে আমরা।
দুর্গাপুর উপজেলার কিছু জায়গা বন্যায় অনেক ক্ষতিগ্রস্ত হয়েছে। উদাহরণস্বরূপ কাউকান্দিয়া গ্রামটি, যেখানে রোহিত বাস করে।
17/6/2022 রোজ শুক্রবার ছিল, সকাল 8 ঘটিকায় পাহাড়ি ডলের বন্যা এসে আমার একটা সুন্দর বাড়ি ছিল। এই বাড়িটা 10 থেকে 15 মিনিট সময়ের ভিতরেই একেবারে বিলীন হয়ে গেছে। ঘরটা এই জায়গায় ছিল, এই বিল্ডিং ঘর ছিল, হাফ বিল্ডিং। তো এইখান থেকে কোনো কিছু নাই, এখন একটা গর্ত হিসাবে পরিচিত। আর অনেকেই জানে যে এখানে কোনো বাড়ি ছিল না, এরকম মনে হয়। কিন্তু যারা দেখছে যে আমার বাড়িটা এত সুন্দর একটা বাড়ি ছিল, এটা আমার শখের বাড়ি ছিল। বাড়ির ভিতরেও অনেক গাছ টাছ ছিল, আম গাছ, টাম গাছ, অনেক ফলফলান্তি গাছ। আর সবচেয়ে আমি গুরুত্ব দিয়েছিলাম যে আমার বাচ্চারা এসএসসি পরীক্ষার্থী, 2023-এ এই ফেব্রুয়ারি মার্চ এপ্রিলে পরীক্ষা হবে। আমি শুধু আগে আমার বাচ্চার বইগুলো টেবিল থেকে একটা লুঙ্গি করে বাসায় শুধু জাস্ট উঠতেই সব কিছু বাসায় নিয়ে গেল।
শুধুমাত্র ওইগুলাই বাঁচাতে পারছি,
এইগুলাই বাঁচাতেছে, আর কোনো কিছু বাঁচানোর কোনো সম্ভব হচ্ছে না। আর আমি এখন যে জায়গায় আছি, অন্যের বাসায় বাসমান হিসেবে, আমি সারাদিন মানুষের সাথে চলাফেরা করি। হয়তো এই সময় দুঃখটা কম হয়, কিন্তু সন্ধ্যার দিকে যখন আমি বাড়িতে ঘুরি তখন আমার ভীষণ কষ্ট হয়।
শুধুমাত্র ঘরই নয়, জলবায়ু পরিবর্তন তার থেকেও বেশি ক্ষতি করে। আমরা জীবনে যা কিছু মূল্য দেই, এটি সব কিছুকেই স্পর্শ করে। এটি আমাদের জীবনকে কল্পনাতীতভাবে ব্যাহত করে। এমনকি খুবই ক্ষুদ্র জিনিস হতে পারে আমাদের ঐতিহ্যবাহী চালের তৈরি কেক, পিঠা।
এটা আমার কাছে অনেক গুরুত্বপূর্ণ। তো আমরা এই যে দুর্যোগে বৃষ্টির কারণে কত ফসল না, আমরা ফসল ঠিক মতনে মারাই পারি না, আগের মতন পিঠা বানাইতে পারি না। আগে পিঠা বানায় নিজেও খাইতাম, আত্মীয় স্বজন দিতাম, প্রতিবেশীকে দিতাম। পরবর্তীতে মনে আগের চেয়ে অনেক কমে গেছে পিঠা বানানি। এমতো দিন আইব একদিন থাকতো আড়াইয়া যাইব। আমরা যে পিঠা বানায় আগে খাইছি, অনেক পোলাহানি দেখছি, অনেক জাতের পিঠা বানাইছি আগে আমরা।
পিঠাটা কেন গুরুত্বপূর্ণ?
গুরুত্বপূর্ণ মানে পিঠাটা বানাইলে মনের মধ্যে ফুর্তি লাগে, আমোদ লাগে, পোলাহানে খা, ঘুরিয়া ঘুরিয়া খা। তারা মনের মধ্যে যে পিঠা বানায় মন হালে লয়ে যাবো এই বাড়ি সেই বাড়ি দৌড় মারিয়া কান্দে পিঠার লাগিয়া। এলে কিন্তু অনেক গুরুত্বপূর্ণ। আগে তো তোমার শীতকালে আমরা পুলি বানাইছি, পোয়া বানাইছি, তারপরে দুধ চিতই বানাইছি, সেমাই বানাইছি, অনেক জাতের পিঠা বানাইছি, দই পিঠা বানাইছি। নারকেল হয় না, বৃষ্টিপাত কম, কড়া বেশি, নারকেলের কলি হইয়া জায়গা সত্ত্বে।
বিশেষভাবে হিন্দু কমিউনিটি ক্ষতিগ্রস্ত হচ্ছে, যেহেতু তাদের বেশিরভাগ প্রথাই প্রকৃতি এবং জমির উপর নির্ভরশীল।
ফুল গাছে এটাই অবস্থা, মানে আর কি ফল ধরে কম, ফুল ধরে কম।
কেন?
এই যে ওয়াইনা মানে পানি দেওয়া সত্ত্বেও মানে আর কি হইতেছে না। এটাই
কি কারণে হচ্ছে না আপনি জানেন বা বুঝতে পারেন?
যে খরান বেশি, তাপমাত্রা, এই কারণে আর কি খরানে মানে যে ফুল, এই যে কলি ঝুড়া পুড়ে যেতেছে না, হয় না। এরকম তো ফলও তো এরকমই নষ্ট হয়ে যায়, ফল গাছের থেকে ফল ঝুড়া পুড়ে যায়, নষ্ট হয়ে যায়।
ফুল ফলটা কেন আপনাদের কাছে গুরুত্বপূর্ণ?
ফুল আমাদের কাছে এই কারণে গুরুত্ব, কারণ এইগুলো আমাদের পূজায় লাগে, কারণ এটাতে আমরা পূজা করি, এই কারণেই মানে আমাদের জন্য এটা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ আর কি বেশি। কম হচ্ছে বলেই তো মানে আমরা মানে এতটা মানে আগে যেরকম করে করতাম, মানে এত ফুল ফল দিয়া মানে খুব মনে একটা আনন্দ রাখিয়া বা অনেককে অনেক হইতো, এখন মানে অনেক আর হয় না। এখন মানে অল্প দেওয়া সেরে আমরা মানে আর কি এটাতে আর কি সন্তুষ্ট করে দিই, যা মানে যে জায়গায় আমরা এত ফুল লাগতো সেই জায়গায় এত ফুলের থেকে মানে অল্প ফুল দিয়ে করি। আর যে জায়গায় আমরা এই যে এত ফুল খাইতে মানে এই যে ভোগ নিবেদন করতাম, মানে এত ফল দিয়ে আর ভোগ নিবেদন করি না, এখন মানে অল্প ফল দিয়ে সেরে আমরা যে ভোগ নিবেদন করি। মানে সবারই মানে আর কি মনটা আর কি অন্যরকমই থাকে, যে আগে এত ফুল দেওয়া পুজো হইতো, এখন এই যে একটা দুটা ফুল দেওয়া পূজা করলে তো এটা কীরকম একটা, হয়তো আমি যা নিয়তে পূজাটা করি হ্যাঁ হয়তো সন্তুষ্ট হইতে পারে, কিন্তু মানুষের মনে তার বলা যায় না।
দুর্যোগ সবাইকে সমানভাবে প্রভাবিত করে না। নারী ও নিম্ন আয়ের পরিবারগুলো বেশি ঝুঁকিপূর্ণ, তারা আরও বেশি ক্ষতির মুখোমুখি হয়।
বন্যার প্রভাব অনেক বেশি হয়েছে। আপনার বন্যার সময় আমি আপনার আরেকবার চৈত্র ফাল্গুন মাসে মনে করেন 60,000 টাকা ঋণ নিয়েছিলাম ডেক্সের থেকে, না একটি কামার থেকে না, হেরে পুরাটা আমি মাছে চাষ করছিলাম। এর 2 বছর আগেও মাছ ছিল। পরে এই টাকাটা যদি উপার্জন হয় বেশি হয়, তাহলে ফুলাখানে লেখাপড়ার খরচাটাও আমরা এন থেকে বাইরে আর ঋণের সুদটাও বাইরে যাবো গা, দিকে ফালাই দিই, কিস্তি কাজ কাম করে আস্তে আস্তে চালাই এমনি। তখন দেখা গেল যে ভাই বন্যা বাসায় লয়ে গেছে গা। আর আমার 6টা ছাগল ছিল, এই ছাগল নিয়ে আমি কী করতে রাখতে পারি না। এর ধান জমিন সব মনে করেন যে ধান জমিন লাগাইলে তো আর ছাগল ফারার মতো সুযোগ নাই। তো আমি ছাগল নিয়ে বেচা মানে আশের কামার দিতে চাইছিলাম। তোর দিক দিয়ে পানি হয়েছে মনে করেন 63টা আশ আমার নিয়ে গেছে ডলে বাসায়। মুরগি মনে করেন 4-5টা বাচ্চা হলো মুরগি নষ্ট হয়েছে, এনদের পুকুরে মাছ গেছে গা। হের বাপের এরকম মানুষ নেই, কেমনে কি আমরা কেমনে আগায়াম।
দুর্গাপুরের মানুষজন এ সকল পরিবর্তনের সাথে মানিয়ে নিতে চেষ্টা করছে, নিজের অস্তিত্বের জন্য যুদ্ধ করে। কামারখালী গ্রামের মানুষেরাও, যে গ্রামটি সোমেশ্বরী নদীর ঠিক তীরেই অবস্থিত।
প্রথম অবস্থায় ছিল ওই আর থেকে আর কি না, অনেক দূরে ছিল। পরে আবার ওখান থেকে বাঙ্গনের আবার এইদিকে আসলাম, আবার বিয়া চেঞ্জ করতে করতে আর কি না 3 ধাপ হয়ে গেছে আমরা। তারপরে নদী বান এমনভাবে ভাঙছে বলার মতো না, আমরা জন্মে এরকম দেখি না এখানে ভাঙনটা আর কি।
এই বছরগুলোতে
বেশি ভাঙছে আর কি না। পরে আবার আমরা নিজেরাই আবার সবাই মিলে আমরা একটা কমিটি গঠন করলাম, সবাই নিয়ে গ্রামের সবাই নিয়ে আমরা বস্তা নিজে সেলাই করে আমরা বালু বললাম। আর আমরা ছেলেগুলা আর কি না যুবকগুলা গ্রামে গ্রামে গিয়ে বাস আর কি না সংগ্রহ করছে, কি সংগ্রহ করিয়া পরে খুঁটি গাড়াইছে। খুঁটি গাড়ানো রাখতে পারলাম না, বস্তাও রাখতে পারলাম না, পরে মানব বন্ধন করলাম। মানব বন্ধন করে পরে সরকার থেকে আমাদের জন্য এই যে দিল আর কি না এই বস্তা,
এই বাঁধটা নির্মাণ করে। এখন কি মনে হয় যে বাঁধটা নির্মাণ করে দিয়েছে আপনাদের, এটা যথেষ্ট টেকসই, এটা দিয়ে আপনাদের হয়ে যাবে?
না, আমরা চাই হলো ব্লক, এটা তো আমাদের টেকসই হইতো না।
তো এটাতে কয় বছর দেখা যাচ্ছে হচ্ছে?
এটা তো আমাদের জন্য মনে হয় 4 থেকে 5 বছর হইতে পারে, না 4 থেকে 5 বছর।
এখানকার মানুষজন আবহাওয়া পরিবর্তনের জন্য সৃষ্টিকর্তাকে দায়ী করে। কেউ কেউ বিশ্বাস করে যে সৃষ্টিকর্তা আমাদের পাপের জন্য মানবজাতিকে শাস্তি দিচ্ছেন। হয়তো তারা সঠিক, মানুষই প্রাকৃতিক ভারসাম্য নষ্ট করছে। এখন আমাদের আরও বিপর্যয়ের সম্মুখীন হতে হচ্ছে। আমি জানি বাংলাদেশের মানুষজন এর জন্য দায়ী নয়, কিন্তু আমাদের জনগণ সবচেয়ে বেশি ভোগে। মানুষের চোখে আমি কষ্ট দেখেছি, আর ব্যাগ ভর্তি গল্প নিয়ে দুর্গাপুর থেকে চলে যাচ্ছি। ক্ষতি, ট্রমা এবং সংগ্রামের অসংখ্য গল্প, এবং আমি বুঝতে পারি যে আমরা একা এই সংগ্রামগুলো কাটিয়ে উঠতে পারি না।
Hello, everyone. Again, so I hope I know it's a little long, but we wanted to share, the stories from the ground so that you can, in these stories we see all the different kinds of impacts, be it it can be, loss of lives or loss of infrastructure, houses, as well as livelihood. So this is a very comprehensive video that we produced last year. And we're happy to showcase this in today's talk, so that you can get a kind of a clear understanding of what are the impacts that are happening on the ground. So now I would like to move forward with the presentation. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay.
Looks great.
Okay, great. So basically today's talk, as I mentioned, that it is basically about the climate justice approach towards loss and damage. And I think the video that we saw is a very clear representation of how that could look like. So we'll touch base on some of the basic ideas of, what loss and damage is, and how it can be interlinked to the concept of climate justice, and a few case examples from other countries in which we're working as well. So to begin with, I'll just give a very brief overview of what the concept of loss and damage basically is. So loss and damage, basically in the context of climate change, refers to the irreversible impacts that the communities suffer when adaptation limits are exceeded. And from this diagram, you can see that these adverse impacts cannot be avoided through mitigation or adaptation efforts. Hence, the residual impacts of climate change is what we are terming as loss and damage. And as you've seen in the video that I showcased earlier, that it encompasses not only economic losses, such as the destruction of property and loss of income, but also, the profound loss of life, loss of biodiversity, loss of cultural heritage, as you've seen that the traditions are now being lost, loss of ecosystem. For example, now fruits and flowers are all being obsolete in today's unpredictable weather and climate. So it is a stark reminder of the kind of reality that climate change is not just an environmental issue, but a profound, social and economic one as well. So when we are trying to link that with the concept of climate justice, so central to our response to climate justice is the principle of, climate justice itself. So climate justice is essentially kind of like a framework that acknowledges the ethical dimensions of climate change. It basically emphasizes that those who have contributed the least to the climate change are the ones who often suffer the worst consequences. As you can see that, a very small country in Bangladesh, in the global south, is facing the impacts, and they don't even know that, these impacts are caused by climate change. Every time we go to these communities, they often say that, we're the ones who are causing this harm. Of course we are, but, it's not just based on the current scenario of how much greenhouse gases we're emitting, but, historical references and historical, stories like industrialization and stuff. So here we try to portray that some of the principles of climate justice we have tried to quote to link it with how loss and damage can be explained through that. So there is the principle of fairness, which is essentially distributing climate burdens and the benefits, equitably. There's the principle of equity, which is essentially recognize the different capabilities and responsibilities. So here comes the historic responsibility and the common but differentiated responsibility of the global north. There's the concept of participation. So every time we because as you can see in the video that I have shown, that the communities, they're the ones who are leading the initiative at firsthand. Every time a disaster hits, be it, non-economic losses or economic losses, they're the ones who act first. And then, the external help arrives. So it's important to make sure that we address their needs, and they're the best people to inform us what responses work for them. So the concept of participation, where where we can involve all the stakeholders and especially the marginalized groups in the decision making process, is very important. And there's a concept of accountability, which is holding those responsible for the climate change, particularly, based on historic emissions, to be accountable for their actions. So basically, this principle of climate justice, it recognizes the impacts of climate change which are not distributed evenly, and the vulnerable communities who have contributed the least to the problem often bear the brunt of these consequences. So it's important to make sure that every time any response for loss and damage comes into play, be it through a fund or through any kind of initiatives that we move forward with, it's, that is designed through a climate justice lens. So here we have developed earlier an infographic which basically talks about how the climate change induced loss and damage can often derail any kind of global goals that we set. So we have the Paris Agreement, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the Sendai Framework achievements. All of these global goals that we aim towards, that we often talk about, that we need more adaptation or we need more development, these all efforts are often undermined when a disaster happens. So for instance, because of climate change, as we know that climate change intensifies the frequency and the intensity of natural disasters that are happening. And this in turn, in fact, hampers all these different SDG efforts or DRR efforts, because anytime a massive event, a natural hazard takes place, the resources that are dedicated for development, they often have to be diverted away, which makes it difficult to achieve these global targets and goals. So it's important to understand the importance of addressing loss and damage and to work towards it so that we can minimize and avert these kind of loss and damage from happening further as we move forward. And we actually cannot talk about climate justice without acknowledging the disproportionate impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities. And vulnerable communities include, the low-income population, indigenous people, and small island states, states like ours, like in the LDCs, of course, in Latin America. So basically, the global south, who are much more lagging behind in the development phase, who are the ones who face these impacts despite having contributed very less. So, and these communities often lack the resources to effectively adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. So here we can see that there are some kind of impacts that often come forward when we're talking about loss and damage. For example, there is the economic losses, so which is the damage to infrastructure, reduced agricultural yields, and loss of livelihoods. There is the health impacts. So for example, now Bangladesh is facing massive heat waves that are happening throughout. I think this year it has been the most record breaking. Every day, the past 1 month, we have been having record breaking heat waves and record breaking temperatures that we have had in the past, 3 decades or so. And that gives rise to a lot of other issues like, vector-borne diseases, for which a lot of actually mortality has been happening. So these are impacts that are born through climate change. Heat waves is an impact of climate change. And, because of these, there are lots of social disruptions as well. For example, in these, the communities that I showed through the video, you can see that there is a lot of migration and displacement that's happening, which often loses, it makes them lose their, there's a loss of kinship, loss of any kind of cultural heritage, any local knowledge that they have from their existing communities, because they're forced to migrate to other cities or other places. So these are just, some disproportionate impacts that vulnerable communities often face. And even within the vulnerable communities, there are further marginalized groups. For example, there are women, there are, disabled population, there are indigenous communities who, even unfortunately, even in today's world, they lack that kind of recognition from every country that they're involved in. So they often face a lot of issues. For example, I can cite an example that very recently we went to this particular district in Bangladesh. Again, that's another coastal area. And there we met this indigenous population, but they are living in water. They are living in boats. They're called floating communities in Bangladesh. They're called the Manta communities, and they actually live on boats because they don't have ownership of lands. They don't have houses in which they can reside. So they seek refuge in boats, and they built those boats. And they are living there. They have their toilets there. They cook there. They're eating there. They have, their family. Their children are growing there. Their children don't have right to education. So these are some marginalized groups, which, despite of the vulnerable communities that are vast in a lot of these global South countries, there are further marginalized groups. So it's important, and they face even further disproportionate impacts. So it's important to make sure that every time we're taking an initiative forward, we keep all these actors in hand so that we can help them to address the already disproportionate loss and damage that we're facing. So there is the concept of historical responsibility and principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which we're terming as CBDR. It's a known phrase in the UNFCCC dictionary. So through these principles, we must recognize that those who have historically contributed to the historical greenhouse gas emissions, for example, these developed countries, having industrialized earlier and contributed to more cumulative emissions over many years, have a greater responsibility to lead in the mitigation efforts and support developing countries through financial and technological assistance. So that is what we have been demanding for, ever since the UNFCCC was born in 1992. Small island states were the first ones to come forward and speak up on how these losses and damages are real, and they will be increasing by the day. So it's important that we start addressing them from now on, and we get the financial and the technical assistance. But after 3 decades of these debates and negotiations, we finally have, some structures in place to address these impacts. And climate justice also emphasizes on the need to recognize and uphold the rights of these communities that are affected by climate change. So this includes, fair treatment and providing adequate compensation for loss and damage incurred due to climate change impacts. Again, in the UNFCCC world, this idea of compensation and liability is a red flag. So ever since the debate of loss and damage has come into play, a lot of the countries in the global north, unfortunately, has been, delaying this, any kind of, proper restructuring or structuring of loss and damage in the, Paris Agreement or any kind of global agreement that the UNFCCC upholds. And, even when the Paris Agreement was formed in 2015, when loss and damage finally had a separate article, even there, the biggest clause was that there will be no, mention of liability or compensation within these, talks. And if there's any mention of these, it's a taboo topic for a lot of the global north countries. So it's important that that is another major portion of climate justice, because when we're talking about climate justice principle, the historical responsibility and CBDR, liability and compensation are two of the major topics which needs to be addressed through the lens of climate justice when we're addressing loss and damage. So it's very depressing, but hopefully with more momentum and traction in the loss and damage concepts, we will hopefully we will bypass that or try to address it simultaneously. So here we can see that, what does a climate justice approach to loss and damage looks like? And it starts with, the concept of equity, which is essentially, ensuring that those most responsible for climate change can bear the responsibility. And we have been trying to, make sure that that comes into play. A lot of civil society, including La Ruta del Clima, has been working tirelessly to advocate that idea. It involves inclusivity, involving affected communities in the decision-making process, and recognizing that their rights to fair treatment and compensation comes into play. It requires redressing, which is providing support and compensation or any kind of financial assistance and technological assistance to the people who are affected by loss and damage. And it definitely entails prevention, taking proactive measures to mitigate and adapt, so that we can minimize the future harms and losses and damages that may come into play. And we have been seeing that devastating impacts of climate change on communities around the world have been happening. And I already showed a video, but I would like to also cite a few case studies in which we have been working with a number of our country partners. So we essentially did a case study in Nepal, in the Melamchi municipality, which basically through that we tried to explain, or we tried to see how losses and damages are coming into play. So they had, for the past 1 year, they have been having catastrophic and unpredictable flooding, which is damaging, nearly all the houses which suffer damage. So if we try to make a comparative analysis, in Bangladesh, we have an annual monsoon season in which flooding happens. So we're more prepared. But for countries like Senegal and countries like Nepal, they don't have that annual, and these erratic weather patterns have been happening for the past, in fact, 2-3 years, these unpredictable weather changes. And for that, those kind of changes, they're not prepared. Hence, they don't have the necessary early warning system in place, the necessary anticipation action strategy in place. So which is why they face a lot of both economic and non-economic impacts. For example, in this particular case study, we have seen that they have a lot of livelihood impact through agricultural loss. For example, due to flooding, arable lands, crops, livestock, everything was heavily affected. And a lot of non-agricultural loss as well, because they have been having a lot of job losses and loss of income and livelihood. And that is another big impact that people are facing, which results in more economic L&D, that we say through trauma, depression, mental health is being affected. And there's of course the issues of mobility and education disruption, because when flooding is happening, the children cannot go to schools. And often in Bangladesh, at least, schools are turned into temporary shelters for cyclone or flood shelters in which people take shelter. So these are some of the impacts that have happened in this particular region in Nepal. And some of the community-led initiatives were basically, as I mentioned, that immediate shelter and relief was provided by neighboring households and neighboring communities. And there was a community group facilitated relief distribution and initiated small infrastructure and rehabilitation projects before the government or the external aid stepped in. So the municipal or the local government intervention again included distribution of relief materials and allocations for funds, for example, dams and river dredging to mitigate future impacts. So what we have found from this particular case study, the challenges that we have found, that community feedback basically highlighted the inadequacies in municipal support, especially regarding flood control measures. And there were concerns regarding the transparency and the efficiency of the fund allocation. And there was a lot of bureaucracy that happens actually a lot. I'm not sure if it happens all throughout Global South, but in Southeast Asia, this the bureaucracy and the processes are actually very tapered. So it's often difficult, and which is why the issues of or the concerns about transparency and accountability comes into play. So basically, through this, we tried to link this with the climate justice approach, how these kind of impacts or the community engagement can be made better, so that we can make sure that these losses and damages are addressed, and from a climate justice lens, so we can develop community-led flood management plans that are culturally relevant and they meet the local needs. So as you have seen in the video earlier, that the communities, they formed local committees through which they had done human chain, and they demanded that the needs of the communities are met through the resource allocation and rebuilding through embankments, and these targeted vocational training or educational programs come into play. So these are some ways in which locally led adaptation is being put in the front row when we're talking about addressing climate change, addressing loss and damage through a climate justice approach. And we did another case study actually in Vanuatu, in the Imau Island, which is kind of situated in Vanuatu's central Shifa province, and it is home to approximately 600 residents across 6 villages. And the Imau Island actually is it's a hotspot for climate change, particularly in terms of sea level rise and coastal erosion. And they also, in fact, that was a very interesting loss and damage that we came across. That they also come across severe droughts at times of when rainfall is inadequate, and for that they actually face a lot of decline in fish stocks and agricultural variability, which affects the local economies. And some of the community responses that they normally do, it's mangrove replanting. As again, this is another thing that we have seen in the island provinces or in the island states. Even we got a case study earlier I think a year ago from Ruta del Clima on mangrove reforestation. That was a very interesting finding that we could relate in this particular case study, that they try to the local responses or the community responses to make sure that further sea level or coastal erosion doesn't come into place through more construction, relocation, and replantation of local trees. And the government intervention in this particular case study are basically long-term responses, for example, through the development of a loss and damage framework, finance mechanism, be it direct cash transfer. So Vanuatu is actually in the forefront of loss and damage advocacy, and they're one of the first countries who has introduced the concept of loss and damage in their NAP, in their NDCs, and they have developed mechanisms to address loss and damage at the national level as well. So we should, a lot of the countries are actually looking forward towards creating similar kind of frameworks as them. And the climate justice approach that we are trying to suggest is that it's important again to integrate local knowledge into these national climate strategies to ensure that these needs of remote communities are met, and to make sure that the national projects that are coming into play, that they ensure that equitable resources are distributed among the communities. I'll not go into details of Bangladesh because I've been talking about it back and forth, but again, this is a picture of one of the floating community boats that we had tried to capture. So as you can see that, in fact, in Bangladesh, if I can cite an example or a comparison, is that a lot of the external aid that comes into Bangladesh goes to the coastal communities, but to a particular region in the coastal community. So there are many other coastal communities which are actually in the more remote areas of Bangladesh. They do not get the necessary assistance. So unfortunately, when we're saying that Bangladesh gets a lot of funding, maybe that goes only in one particular community and not the rest. So that this doesn't this completely violates the concept of equitable distribution. And we have seen this exact thing in this particular region, which is the Borishal area, that that particular community or union that received little to no attention for support from government or even humanitarian aid. And the only form of support from the NGOs that receive is through microcredit loans, which is worse because, again, whenever we're talking about loss and damage fund, if it's in the form of debt, that will increase to the vulnerability of the countries and the communities. So similarly, a similar framework comes into play when we're talking about the communities, that every time we're giving them aid, it should be in the form of more sustainable livelihood options. Or in fact, these communities, when we're directly talking to them, when we ask them that, do you prefer cash transfers or do you prefer some kind of longer term programmatic help? So they said that if there are livelihood options, if there are vocational training through which they can learn some skills to earn their livelihood, they would prefer that over direct cash transfers because that's not sustainable in the long run. So these are some things that we need to learn from the communities and try to make sure that we incorporate them when we're designing the loss and damage fund. So some of the policy recommendations from our end, particularly from the climate justice lens, is incorporating fairness, equity, and accountability into the international agreements, as well as the national policies. creating dedicated funds for loss and damage. Again, we have the loss and damage fund now. Finally, a decision has been made, but there is no money. And even from the national perspective, a separate window for loss and damage should be there in the budgets, in the national budgets, where we can tap into every time an extreme or a slow onset disaster sets in, and that kind of framework or mechanism should be in play already. And we shouldn't be waiting only for the UNFCCC to come up with that kind of ideas or concepts or mechanism. And it's very, very important, what I've been saying through the entire talk, that it's important that we encourage these community-driven ideas and initiatives and projects to make sure that these local knowledges help build that local resilience and sustainable solutions. So when we're talking about the kind of the challenges, addressing these multifaceted challenges of climate change and requires overcoming significant obstacles such as political resistance, lack of resources, and institutional barriers. Again, if I delve a little deeper into it, political resistance often arises from conflicting interest and short-term priorities of each. Every time a new government comes in, they have their own motto and agenda, and hindering the implementation of effective climate policies. So moreover, the scarcity of the resources for both financial and technological poses a significant challenge to communities and governments striving to combat climate change. So it's important that these political resistance often is met, and there's a longer term vision towards how to address loss and damage. Similarly, institutional barriers, as I mentioned, that bureaucratic inefficiencies and outdated policies, they impede the coordinated action which is needed to address the urgent threat of climate change through losses and damages. Again, citing an example, I'm sorry that I always try to connect these theories and these ideas with real life realities. So if I'm talking about Bangladesh, we started this idea of developing a national mechanism on loss and damage back in 2016, right after the Paris Agreement was decided and Article 8 was provided. But the conflict of who's going to lead this national mechanism arose between the Ministry of Climate Change and Ministry of Disaster, and then the process completely stalled. So ever since the decision now of the loss and damage fund came into play, now the government wants to restart. It's great that you're trying to restart, but this mechanism should have been already in place by now. From 2016 to now 2024, there has been so many years, and we could come up with a fantastic way of addressing loss and damage throughout the country, even if no external aid is coming, but we could use our own resources as much as possible to address the now losses and damages in Bangladesh is at an extreme point, be it from heat waves, be it from unpredictable weather changes, be it from flooding, cyclones, everywhere. So if we had that mechanism in place, which again was stalled because of bureaucratic inefficiencies, we could address these impacts on time. And it's very important to make sure that that happens. So sorry. So basically now the main question, that how the loss and damage fund that have been finally put in place in the UNFCCC world, how can that deliver climate justice? So the civil society and the activists have been advocating for an adequate funding for the loss and damage fund, and emphasizing the need for substantial financial contribution to address the needs. And despite the ongoing pledges that have been coming from 2020, from COP26 in 2021, the current contributions actually fall far, far short of hundreds of billions of dollars for the fund size that is required for the developing countries. And this amount, the current expected need actually for the fund size, according to a lot of civil societies, is to initially contribute about $400 billion annually to this loss and damage fund. And this amount aligns with estimated economic costs and reflects historical responsibility of developed nations and major polluters for the climate crisis. And however, they need to move beyond this arbitrary and voluntary modality of donations, and they should, comply or pledge to a sustainable, amount of funding every year from each of the developed countries. And for this to happen, countries need to agree on a funding structure where the rich and the polluting countries need to annually contribute to a predetermined sum of money and not on a voluntary basis, which is, one of the attribute that was decided when the loss and damage fund was created. The fund should grow along with the increasing cost of losses and damages to be determined using a standardized method that takes into account the local knowledge. So the fund needs to be, again, another very, very important part that the civil society has, been very upfront about, is the fund needs to be new and additional, because there is a very big risk of, a redistribution of funds. So when, climate finance is talked about, it includes mitigation, adaptation, and now loss and damage. So there is a very big risk of underfunding the actual, loss and damage fund, because there can be, saying that we're giving the climate funds, but it can be for any of the three, pillars or areas. So this redistribution could jeopardize the global efforts to effectively address loss and damage. So, and of course, there is the concept of equity and redistribution. So any proposed mechanism must prioritize equity and redistribution, ensuring that the polluters bear the financial burden and that the funds flow to the most affected communities. So, strict regulations are necessary to prevent, that kind of existing inequalities and injustices. As I mentioned, that if a fund is allocated, it should be on a more programmatic manner to make sure that this is sustainable and long term, and so that it doesn't go in the form of loans or increase the debt variability of those countries, already vulnerable countries. It should be in the form of grants. So these are some major asks of the civil society that they have been advocating for ever since, the idea of loss and damage fund was developed. So basically, underscoring the urgency and the need to address loss and damage fund, we have developed a few call to action, and the time for action is actually now. It is very imperative to prioritize the concepts, the principles of equity and climate action, and urging the policymakers and the stakeholders to integrate these climate justice principles into the decision-making process when they're designing the loss and damage fund. As you know, that the loss and damage fund after COP28 they now have a loss and damage fund board. The first meeting took place already. It went off to a good start, but it has to be more quick. Now with initially where the World Bank was, chosen to be the host for the loss and damage fund, that was very controversial, because of course their main goal is a loan modality, as I have been mentioning over and over. But with a lot of developing countries, they have raised their voice against it, and they have actually come up with a set of clauses. And, I think that there were about 11 exit points that if they don't do this, if the World Bank violates this particular principle, they cannot be the host, or they cannot be the secretariat. So that's very applaudable that, these motions have been set in place. But again, it's very important to make sure that whatever the fund board comes up with, whatever, principle or whatever mechanism it comes up with, it is fast, it is agile, and it addresses the needs of the vulnerable community. So it cannot be, something that's prescribed, something that has, a set of ideas of what we will fund and what we won't, because losses and damages are unpredictable in nature. As you have seen in the case studies that we have shown, each of the countries are actually facing impacts that they haven't faced before. Bangladesh is facing heat waves, which were not a thing in Bangladesh. Nepal has been facing flooding, which was not, again, an important impact that has been happening. So whatever modality the loss and damage fund does come up with, it has to make sure that it is, it addresses the needs of the vulnerable communities. That is the most important principle that it should address. So I think I'll stop here. I have spoken a lot, and thank you for listening to me for so long. And over to you, Adrian.
No, thank you, Nusrat. It has been awesome, and you have pretty much covered a lot of issues that are super important, and that I'm very happy that you have addressed, and especially sharing from your side of the world how loss and damage is felt, and how the struggle for rights in terms of addressing losses damage is being led by many people from your region, and that's something that we were very keen to try to share in these webinars, and we're very happy that you have done it. I think for Latin Americans, and also especially for people from my region, Central Americans, the issue of loss and damage is something that manifests very similar, maybe it's differences, but also very focused on how vulnerable communities are dealing with it. We have one question, and then I have a couple of them that I hope you could help us out and address. The first one comes from Catalina Jara, and well, she says, "Thank you for your presentation. Could you please explain with a little more deeply how does mechanisms that are based in debt work, and how is this affecting vulnerable countries?" I guess that's probably linked with how the Loss and Damage Fund is enabled to provide funding through loans.
Yeah. Am I on mute?
No, yeah, you're live. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So essentially, when we're talking about financial aid, it should be the form of aid or grants, and financing mechanisms based on debt, for example, what the World Bank provides, or loans. They often play a significant role in a lot of development and climate related projects. But debt financing involves borrowing money from external sources, and while it provides immediate funds, it can lead to debt distress. And that often the countries who are already they don't have enough resources or enough capacity to repay those debts, they get financially burdened. And if these international aids and grants, they offer assistance, financial assistance without this repayment obligation, that would be more efficient or more helpful to take forward climate resilience efforts. So I think that's what I had to say.
Yeah, it's super important, this issue of debt, and first of all, because the Loss and Damage Fund is within the financial arrangements mechanism, and both of them are either led by the World Bank, as well, it's sort of administered by the World Bank, the Loss and Damage Fund, but then the financial arrangement, which sometimes seems to be this greater umbrella, it's also the IMF and the World Bank are involved to find solutions. And both institutions and also regional development banks, their core work is to generate more loans. And for example, coming from as a Costa Rican, we've seen all our social services reduce because we already have a huge debt. So if we put that on top of what we're having, then our social services go down, and when social services go down, vulnerability increases. One of the things that I think, at least we as La Ruta are very interested is how can these principles on climate justice could be introduced as the Loss and Damage Fund and the financial arrangements are developed, because right now it seems a little bit weak and there's many criticisms and concerns, but maybe we could reform it, maybe we could transform it. So how can we have a financial arrangement and a Loss and Damage Fund that comes from an approach from climate justice principles? How would you imagine it?
Well, we have been asking this ourselves, and the entire designing of the Loss and Damage Fund is definitely a complex and intricate process. But when we're talking about climate justice, two things come into play. One is that money is extracted from where it should be, That is basically if we can allocate or attribute how much or which countries would be more suitable to make sure that, I mean, Global South can also contribute to the loss and damage fund, but I think the more industrialized or developed countries should be the ones to come forward and pay a major chunk. So that is one important criteria that should be introduced when designing the loss and damage fund. That again, it should not be in the voluntary basis, right? It is right now, so it should be in the form of more, necessary, and every year they should be paying a certain amount and not, again, shouldn't be double counting or shouldn't, direct or divert resources from other pledges or commitments that they have made earlier. And this is the first part, that historical responsibility is a big chunk of climate justice. And the second one is basically listening to the people and listening to the vulnerable communities, and listening to their needs. Because this when every time we're talking to people, negotiators, and people from the north, they often say that it should when we're talking about the loss and damage fund, we can a prescribed set of ideas of we should give a money for this project or that project, but that shouldn't be the case. It should be more agile, I feel, and it should be more flexible. So and it should meet the needs of the people. So when we're talking about designing the loss and damage fund through a climate justice lens, or forming making sure that climate justice is achieved through the loss and damage fund, is to make sure that people and their agency is restored. So more participation from the local, the indigenous population, the marginalized people is presented when making these decisions. Of course, the loss and damage fund board is not going to have that, but even when the loss and damage fund board doesn't allow civil society to participate or to have their voices heard in the meetings, that is that shows that that they don't have that will, the political will, that they want to listen to the people or the voices of different vulnerable countries. So it's important to make sure that these things are in place when the fund is being designed.
And I think with what you were saying about funding, a interesting way to sort of picture it is, if we think about the person, the man that lost his house in your video, he's clearly living somewhere else, and to do so, he had to pay for it. So in the Global South, we're already paying for international transboundary harm with our own money, even though we're the least responsible for it. So it's not that there is no money, we're already paying for it. It's that the big countries that have generated actually pay something, which they are not currently willing to. And I guess the last question, so we can let you go, because I'm not sure if it's very early or very late where you are, but I think one of the important things that you mentioned that we're also very concerned is the lack of participation of indigenous people, peasant communities, fisher communities, local communities in general in this whole discussion and in the implementation of whatever nationally or internationally is done to address loss and damage. First of all, how should they participate, and how can we generate dialogue? Because there's a lot of coherence and similarities between the suffering that we're seeing in the Global South, but there's very little dialogue among community leaders and among local NGOs on these issues.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'll go back to, if we're talking about bottom up, I'll just go back to the local level first. So, even nationally, when we're trying to establish a mechanism to address loss and damage, in our national policies, it's important that these responses, needs, gaps, challenges, everything comes from the ground. So now that we're again in the process of rebuilding that national mechanism, the first thing we're actually trying to develop is some local L&D hubs, loss and damage hubs, to make sure that we get that kind of local participation and engagement, and these local communities who have that kind of understanding, and they can inform us of the needs. And then once we have these local loss and damage hubs, they can be the representative of the national mechanism, as well as they can represent in the global fora. But again, I'll just restate that kind of availability to participate in international fora is very, very limited. Even people like us who are in the civil society or in the observer organizations, we don't get access to a lot of these meetings and a lot of these decisions and discussions. So if because we are the ones who can bring these people in the forefront, we can try to engage them. And if the rules of attending these meetings to make decisions, if those are more laxed, if those are more engaging and participating, that way I think organizations like ICAD and La Ruta del Clima, we can make that kind of bridge and liaison between the two worlds. So yeah, that's all I can say.
Thank you. Yeah, and hopefully we get more NGOs and community leaders to join in this discussion. I think it's super important, and there is much to do, much to open, much to gain in exercising our right to justice. And we want to thank Nusrat Naushin from ICAD for her words and sharing her wisdom and experiences, and also what it's been done and how it's been addressed loss and damage by communities in her region. We're very thankful for that. And so Nusrat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so
and
much.
Everybody else, have a very good day or evening wherever you are, and we see you later. Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you so